Stay informed.
Stay informed and up to date.
Stay informed and up to date.
At your one-stop shop for the Minnesota House of Representatives.
There are amendments at the desk.
One stop.
Your one-stop shop.
Session daily.
Session daily.
Session daily.
Session daily.
House stands adjourned.
It's been a little over a month since the gavel fell on the last day of the 2013 legislative session.
I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 12 noon Tuesday, February 25th, 2014.
But just because session is over doesn't mean the work stops.
I've had some nights of sleep, but also had a chance to sort of get out in the community. It's sort of you can get kind of insular at the Capitol there, so it's good to get back into the community.
Interim is the time between sessions, and lawmakers use it in a variety of ways, including working on their citizen jobs, taking care of constituent needs, researching and vetting more complicated policy issues, and serving on task force, commissions, and policy committees.
There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. We all do a lot of research and reading and preparing for next year.
The Select Committee on Living Wage Jobs will be the first committee to meet during the interim to begin preparing for next year's session.
When I first was selected to be on the committee, my hope was that we could explore the public-private partnership relationship and how we could create jobs and living wage jobs through those partnerships.
Committee members are scheduled to hear testimony about economic development strategies and review work subsidy programs. In particular, the committee will hear about a new jobs program modeled after the Minnesota Emergency Employment Development, or MEED program. It was in place from 1983 to 1989. The program subsidized the employer's cost to hire new workers, many of whom were low-skilled or among the long-term unemployed.
I think you have to look at historically how the program operated, what were its successes, what were things that perhaps weren't as successful. The big question that always comes up is, would these jobs have been created or available without the subsidy?
These questions and others will likely be addressed during the meeting. The Select Committee on Living Wage Jobs is expected to put together recommendations for consideration on how to improve the job climate in Minnesota. We will have to wait and see what will be included in these recommendations. Let's now go live to the committee meeting.
convene the committee officially when we have one more member join us. And so thank you for coming. This legislative session, Minnesota made some significant new investments in economic development programs, including a new job creation fund, I think it was called, that had some important performance-based requirements for receiving funds to create jobs. And there's long been a debate about the effectiveness of these programs and what they do and how they're held to be accountable for the jobs that they create. And so we wanted to have a hearing on that to get some national expertise on how Minnesota stacks up, what we might be able to do better to make these programs more effective. And for that reason, we invited Greg Leroy from the organization Good Jobs First, and we are going to start out with his testimony. So, Mr. Leroy, if you could officially identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Greg Leroy. I'm the Executive Director of Good Jobs First, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group based in Washington, D.C.
Please proceed.
Thank you. It's great to be back here. I was just reminiscing with people about the history I have in the state, which dates back to the mid and late 1980s. So we're a resource for public officials and nonprofit groups on reforming state and local economic development. We've trained for numerous associations of public officials like the National League of Cities, the Council of Development Finance Agencies, the International Economic Development Council. And we focus specifically on the toolkit, that is the economic development incentives that states have. The average state has more than 30 on the books, and the best estimate we can give you in terms of total cost at all state and city and county levels is about $70 billion per year, affecting every form of fee or tax that companies would normally pay to support public services. So just to review a few basics about the way the system works in the United States, the site location system. It's not me saying this, it's people who make a living helping companies find the most profitable locations that taxes and tax breaks almost never matter because they're too small a cost factor in companies' decision-making process. The business basics, labor, occupancy, proximity to customers, proximity to suppliers, other key inputs depending on whatever the company makes or does, are the things that really drive how companies decide where to expand or relocate. But as the system has evolved in the United States since the 1930s, when companies pit places against each other, cities or states against each other, public officials are what's in the classic game theory prisoner's dilemma, where they're supposed to passively relate one-on-one with the company during the competing process. This enables companies to do what we call job blackmail, that is threatening to leave a place if they're not given a retention package, or to pit localities or states against each other, what's called the economic war among the states. And you'll be hearing from somebody else later today, Art Rolnick, the former vice president of the Minneapolis Fed, who's written eloquently about that as well. And certainly it's not just states against each other, it's neighboring suburbs against each other, as we documented in 2 studies here in the Twin Cities. And at the heart of this process, and many of the biggest deals, are site location consultants, that is, people who make their living representing companies as intermediaries in the process, and they're not regulated or registered. There's a lot of harm to this process. I'll just rip through a few of them before we get to some specific policy things for Minnesota. But in our opinion, because of the way the process plays out, a lot of people have an exaggerated sense of the significance of taxes or tax breaks in the decision-making process. Because taxes, state and local taxes combined, equal less than 2% of the average company's cost structure, and often more like 1.5% or less, shaving some fraction of that tiny percentage off of a company's cost structure just can't move the needle very much. Small changes in the big cost factors really matter much more. We also
Leroy,
see... Sure.
Just excuse me for a second. We do have a quorum, and so the committee will come to order. Please proceed.
You bet. Another problem we see is over-subsidization of retail. This is especially true in some states with their use of tax increment financing. An example that was raised by a St. Paul-based company, Gander Mountain, was criticisms of 2 other competing big-box outdoor sporting goods chains, Cabela's and Bass Pro, which have both been very aggressive in seeking TIF and other kinds of economic development subsidy packages from a number of their stores and warehouses around the United States. I tip my hat to Gander Mountain as one of the few cases of a company actually calling out competitors on this issue, and I know they're based here. Another problem is the fact that your tax base is often harmed in ways that undermine things that really do matter for economic development. And one thing we do know from academic literature long term is that skills and infrastructure matter a lot to the long-term trajectory of job creation and income growth. And if you harm your tax base for those two things in the name of economic development, that could be sort of perverse unintended consequences. We've also documented, and twice here in the Twin Cities and other places in other states, a total of 12 other metro areas in other states, that economic development incentives often cause sprawl. And I'll do a couple more maps from this study in a minute. But the net effect we found, especially in larger cities and larger metro areas, is that economic development incentives tend to be anti-central city, anti-inner ring suburb. Because a lot of the costs are not well accounted for, because tax expenditures especially are the least well accounted for form of spending in general by states, and especially in the specific domain of economic development, the net effect can be covert budget erosion, that is, sort of death by a thousand cuts. Because the Governmental Accounting Standards Board has never promulgated standardized regulations for the way states must account for tax-based expenditures, including tax-based economic development expenditures, we don't have apples-to-apples ways to compare states or cities in their spending for taxes for economic development. And finally, there's unpublished data, especially, and we're trying to replicate it now, which strongly suggests that in the allocation of dollars and deals, many of the biggest state programs are quite profoundly biased against small and locally owned companies, even though most people agree that they have a lot better bang for the buck and are certainly more likely to create jobs and to not run away.
Mr. Chair?
Representative Mahoney.
Could I ask you a question about the small bias?
Representative Mahoney and all members, please feel free to jump in at any time. We're going through pretty quickly, so go ahead.
You've got a full agenda, so I don't want to hold things up too much, but when you say the bias against small and local entrepreneurs, you wholeheartedly agree with you. Do you have or have you studied where that is a bigger problem versus not? So is it a bigger problem in Texas versus Colorado or Minnesota versus Wisconsin?
We haven't. There's an unpublished study that we're trying to resurrect and publish now. It was written for a group that subsequently went belly up, and therefore didn't publish the study. And it looked at 15 primarily rural states. So it didn't capture a lot of the bigger states, and Texas is not among it, for instance. And there were some variations. Some states are a little bit less biased than others. We're also trying to replicate that study now, looking at some more urbanized states to capture bigger numbers of deals. But I think it's fair to say that, and it's certainly intuitive, I think most people close to these issues understand that, especially the city groups and the other big companies that have the armies of tax consultants and site location consultants have and obviously the greatest ability to move capital or to threaten to move capital, have the most leverage in this system, and they use it. And they take it to the bank, so to speak. Yeah.
Representative Mahoney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you do resurrect the study or continue with a new study, it would be we all get studies. I have stacks of them in my office. The recommendations at the end are the important piece, and the recommendation of if we're going to continue the arms race, so to speak, right, how do you incentivize small and local companies because they tend to stay where they're found? And that's the question, and I don't need an answer.
No, you'll see in my policy recommendation slide coming up that we recommend restricting or capping the amount spent on bigger companies to more intentionally direct more money to local and small businesses. We're totally, and I think there's good evidence about superior bang for the buck as well. Thank you.
Mr. Leroy, Representative Kiefer, I think, has a question as well.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leroy, are we going to talk about living wages eventually? Because
yes.
I'm just wondering where this is going, and maybe you'll address this question then, is since you work for a national, you have a bigger oversight, would it be a good idea for Minnesota to increase minimum wage even higher than the national wage?
We're not.
Thank you.
Leroy. Sure. We're not a group that has published on minimum wage. We focus on economic development incentives, so we focus on what's called job quality standards attached to incentives. In fact, the very first study we ever did was based here in Minnesota 15 years ago, looking at companies that received incentives under your economic development incentive programs here in the state. So we recommend what are called market-based job quality standards. That is, again, sort of applying the theory of economic development. We say that it's consistent with the theory of economic development that you would attach wage standards to companies receiving incentives that mirror those wages already paid in the same industry or the same labor market, so that you're not paying companies to pull wages down, essentially.
And Representative Kiefer, I would just add that while the last legislative session focused for various reasons a lot on the minimum wage, that isn't by any stretch the only purpose of this committee. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have a hearing on this topic was to better understand the outcomes that we're creating through these economic development programs, so that we can be sure that when we're spending taxpayer money to create jobs or subsidize various types of businesses, that we're getting the best outcome that we possibly can for that. And I think that is important for the question of the kinds of jobs we are creating in Minnesota and whether they pay living wages. So that's why we're addressing this.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Leroy, I have a question.
Sure.
Could you just give us any feel or suggestion on this topic? You did a little bit to Representative Mahoney's point about small businesses and local entrepreneurs. And you mentioned capping the amount of money that can go to certain kinds of programs. But it also occurs to me that most small entrepreneurs or local businesses just don't really have government programs on their radar screen. They don't really know how to access that necessarily, and there are kind of a lot of barriers of information and access. I'm wondering if you have recommendations for bringing some of those down as well.
We have not studied specific comparative effectiveness of small business programs. I can certainly refer you to people who have. What they say generally are that you want programs that provide things that the market isn't. That is, access to credit and working capital up front, which is especially vital in the early life cycle of startup companies. Subordinated debt, cash loans, convertible grants, et cetera, because that's especially in the wake of the credit crisis of 2009, and since that's the biggest gap that so many small businesses are facing. And certainly we would endorse, and there's varying landscapes of technical assistance through SBA and SCORE and all those kinds of things, and we think those are important as well. But I also think that sending signals, if you have a program which is clearly structured in a way that's easy for small businesses to access, and you reach out to small business associations, including the growing landscape of alternative independent business alliances and so on, I think there's demand. So,
okay, please proceed.
Thank you. And certainly right now, because of the situation with still depressed revenues in most states and no more federal aid to states or cities, but rising public expectations about transparency, we think, right now we're just seeing a lot of push for reform at the state and local level. So the theme of what I'd like to say today is that Minnesota was once kind of a leader in this area and now is really very much in the middle of the pack. In fact, in 1995, your state enacted, it was what I think of as kind of the information beachhead, if you will, because of the enactment of your disclosure law that year, which was the first data we used to publish our first study after I founded Good Jobs First 3 years after the law was enacted. So by 2007, 23 states had some degree of online disclosure. You notice most of them sort of are geographically proximate to Minnesota. It's almost like the idea spread by land there. And that's when we began grading the states for the first time. We issued our first report card study in 2007, grading the quality of disclosure that states had for their incentive programs. 3 years later, 37 states were now disclosing. And we'd really reached a tipping point by then, and that's when we began actually electronically capturing the data that the states disclose and combining it into one downloadable, searchable website toolkit that we have called Subsidy Tracker. And today, as we prepare our third report card study, which will issue either late this year or early next year, only 5 states are no longer are in the dark, so to speak. And even in those states, we've already published data and have other sources and include them in our Subsidy Tracker database. So this is certainly an idea whose time has come.
Representative Mahoney.
Please.
Who is the best?
Illinois. Illinois has won both of our report card studies. Wisconsin actually came in a pretty good second.
Okay.
Please proceed.
Sure. But if you look at where Minnesota stands now in our report card studies, you're sort of middle of the pack. And I'll give comparative rankings in a minute as well. But in terms of absolute scores on a 100-point scale for our 3 report card studies, you can see the Minnesota score only 29 out of 100 on transparency, only 38 on job quality and job creation, and only 49 on monitoring and enforcement. And these are report cards grading 5 of your biggest programs.
Mr. Leroy, are you going to drill into each one of these categories?
I will give you the breakdown scores for each of the programs, yes, coming right up.
And explain the methodology for determining these numbers?
I can if you wish. I mean, I have the metrics here with me. I have the pieces of paper I flashed at you before the hearing. Yeah, sure. So these are the programs that we graded. They're your 5 of your major programs that we graded. And I'll point out later that, in dollar figures, your tax increment financing program, which obviously derives from state, local revenue rather than state, is a bigger dollar spender than these 5 programs. But these are the 5 programs that we graded for the report card studies. And here are the overall grades that you got, the combined aggregate scores for each thing. So we gave you a D on transparency and ranked the state 20th among the 50 states in the district. D plus for job creation and job quality, ranked 25th, and 23rd at a C minus for enforcements and clawbacks.
This is not graded on a curve, then.
Yeah, it's not, because when you have, originally 23 states and then 13 states not disclosing at all, you have a lot of zeros really pulling the whole curve down. That's true. So here's the score. So again, you see 3 numbers after the name of each program. The first score is the transparency score. The second score is the job creation and job quality score. And the third is the enforcement and clawback score. So you can see in 3 cases, 1 program got at least 1 goose egg. 3 programs got zeros on their disclosure metrics. The Business Development Public Infrastructure Grant Program, the Minnesota Investment Fund, and the R&D tax credit. And then numerous other low scores here in the teens for various metrics. And I can, if you want to, get into the weeds about the metrics, but suffice it to say that we've had a very positive response from state governments to these report cards. We know for a fact that at least in 35 states we've reached the attention of the governor or the Commerce Secretary because they've commented publicly on our studies, or they've in some cases sought our assistance to do what they can to get a better grade the next time we issue a report card study. It's a matter of public record that we've assisted the states of Tennessee and Maryland on improving their disclosure portals, for instance, and we freely give that advice to anybody who asks for it. So what we haven't had, just to anticipate a question, are criticisms or differences about the methodology. We show you everything that we graded you on. We make it clear how we determined what score you got on each metric. Most of the metrics have about between 10 and 13 different variables that go into the scores. So we really have become kind of the arbiters of what's a good web presence, for instance, on disclosure on incentives.
Representative Keeper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leroy, can you give us a little bit of, I'm not sure if this includes I don't know how far back this goes, but I understand that you had some thoughts on the 2009 ARRA money and how Minnesota was handling that lump sum of money. Could you just explain maybe for the committee a little bit on that?
Sure, and I didn't bring those scores with me, but we could dial them up quickly if you have an internet connection. We also issued 2 report cards grading the states on their Recovery Act websites, one in the summer of 2009 and again in January of 2010. The studies are called Show Us the Stimulus and Show Us the Stimulus Again. It's fascinating. None of these websites are required by the law. All the states did them voluntarily because they wanted to make sure their citizens knew where the money was going. The raw data behind all of them actually came from the federal recovery.gov website. But we graded the states on how well they interpreted the law and presented the spending in their state to taxpayers. Did they break it down in some way? Did they explain in layman's terms, the use of the money and the purpose of the grants and contracts and so on. And I'd be glad to pull those up for you if you want to look at them or discuss them. Memory doesn't serve to remind me how well Minnesota did on those report cards, and I can't remember now. Sure.
Thanks.
Please proceed.
So to talk about what we see as solutions for these are really the policy punchlines of our various studies. So on disclosure, we recommend online disclosure of the costs and benefits and outcomes, that is, actual jobs created, actual wages paid, and so on, of each deal over time as they play out. That's how you get a 100-point score on our disclosure report cards. For accounting purposes, to solve this problem about the lack of tax expenditure, standardized tax expenditure accounting by GASB, we recommend what's called a unified economic development budget. That is a document that you as legislators would get every year, cobbling together all forms of spending that the state makes for economic development, all the appropriations that would show up things like training grants or subordinated debt and so on, as well as the tax-based expenditures, the tax credits, the tax exemptions, and so on. You already have a lot of the elements to do this because rare among states, your Legislative Audit Bureau combines and collates information about your TIF districts. That's not typical. Very few states do that, and that's a good thing. You're well on your way to doing that if you were to so choose to do it. On the job quality standards, as I mentioned in response to the question, we recommend what are called market-based wage standards, and that actually dates back, like I said, to our original study here in Minnesota in 1999. On monitoring and clawbacks, we recommend that it be disclosed how companies are doing against their job creation or dollar investment obligations or whatever the quid pro quo is, and then over time also have disclosed whether or not they were subject to compliance punishment or not for failure to fall short. We know in the recession that the number of companies that were subject to clawbacks spiked. You'd expect that in a recession, and some states that, including Texas and Illinois, disclosed it, and it was clear it was happening, and the sky didn't fall, but it was a matter of public information that more deals were falling short, and therefore more funds were being recovered so they could be redeployed for other deals. I should hasten to add, in mentioning that episode, that there's no evidence that any state that has adopted any of these safeguards I'm recommending has in any way harmed its business climate. There's no, as the person who's been advocating these since I wrote my first book 19 years ago on them, there's no evidence, like I say, to suggest that a state lost a deal or harmed its business climate or deterred site location consultants from considering a place because they had sunshine or clawbacks in place. Another thing we recommend is that the school board have control of its own share of the property tax base. Very few states give any role, much to speak of at all, for school boards in their revenue loss that they suffer in either property tax abatements or the diversion of property taxes by tax increment financing. We also recommend what we call location efficiency, and this is the punchline of the mapping study that I'll show you in a minute here. That is, in urban areas, we recommend that incentive eligibility be targeted to areas that are served by transit, so within a half a mile of a regularly served transit corridor or station. On retail, we're not against incentives for retail if they really meet the definition of the word incentive. That is, if they're really bringing retail to a place that needs it but doesn't have it. A food desert would be a classic example, right? The trouble is we know that lots of companies, including many of the chains that are so aggressive, Target, Walmart, Cabela's, Bass Pro, there's no shortage of them, are very aggressive getting incentives that really aren't serving true economic development needs like a food desert. And finally, as we already talked about, redirecting money to small and locally owned businesses.
Mr. Chair?
Representative Mahoney.
Well, Mr. Leroy, most of this is online, I think is what you're trying to get to. Mm-hmm. And in Minnesota, the issue for us might be that almost 80% of our job incentives go to greater Minnesota. Mm. The Minnesota Investment Fund, what you have up there is jobs incentive. We call it Job Z. Mm-hmm. Redevelopment funds, much of the workforce training funds. All this goes out to greater Minnesota. Although one of my colleagues said that this was an urban session, I kind of laughed at that. So, is there the capability in, the town of 3,000 people to keep this kind of a website up? Or is this just going to be another cost added on to the state to supplement to greater Minnesota or any more rural area?
You're talking about the burden of disclosure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because in our model legislation on our website, we really view this as a proper role of the state. And it's a very simple annual transmission of a few numbers by the jurisdiction about each deal to the state agency that then puts it on the website. I mean, that's the irony of some of the states that we still call non-disclosing states. Everybody has the information in a spreadsheet. It's not like they aren't tracking where the deals are going. Some states are just so kind of asleep at the switch right now, they're not even taking what's already in a spreadsheet and dumping it in a non-searchable PDF on a website somewhere. I mean, that's part of the thing we're getting them is just shame them to do that. So I don't think there is any burden here.
Catholic?
Yeah, I just don't think there is any burden here at all to speak of. I mean, put it conversely, if you're telling me you don't have a list somewhere of the deals you've done and how they're doing, then I would really question the agency about, like, should they be in the business? That would be 101 about watching the store. So, sure. TIP has been a...
Mr. Laurie, Representative Keeper.
Please.
I've got to go back to this transparency thing and the job creation scores because they're really low.
Sure.
And while we were talking, I did look up the ARR comments that you made, and you said something like once the money gets shifted into two different hands, you kind of lose track of where it's going.
Correct.
So I wondered what happened in Minnesota in 2009, and then on the job creation part, what could we have done better to get a better score? It's kind of loaded questions.
Sure. And two separate questions. Yeah. On the ARA thing, this was a national data challenge that everybody trying to figure out the Recovery Act faced, and that was that under the original guidelines issued by the Office of Management and Budget, after the money changed hands twice, which would be like USDOT, MnDOT, primary contractor, then the reporting obligations ended. And so it was very difficult to talk about subcontractors or if the contract involved multiple sites, even the location of the expenditures. And that was a big frustration for people who were looking at things like the geographic distribution of the money and so on, much less job creation. And this is a persistent challenge. I mean, but the good news is that the protocols promulgated by OMB for ARA live on now at usaspending.gov, and that the quality of data coming out of that federal portal is much better than it used to be because they basically took ARA as kind of USA Spending 2.0, and I can certainly refer you to people who are more directly involved in monitoring that website. There's also another website run by a group called the Center for Effective Government called fedspending.org, which prides itself on actually having somewhat cleaner versions of the same data and might be a better place to start. On your scores for job creation, and I'll have to get my reading glasses out here, it looks like the lowest single score you got was on the Job Skills Partnership Program. So, for instance, it has no wage requirements. That's a big hit on the score. It has no health care requirements. Those would be the two biggest point losses on its scores. It does not, the performance requirements it does have do not endure for the duration of the facility, and it doesn't have a safeguard about intrastate job shifting either in terms of the major metrics.
Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Chair, just for the information of the witness and the rest of the committee, that was an issue that we tried to do about 5-6 years ago. And again, that was stymied by the people who got most of the money.
Representative Mahoney, would you care to expand on that? Just for our edification.
I don't know that I want to get too deep into it because I've been accused of being, this session of being metro-centric, and I have really worked hard to grow jobs in Greater Minnesota, but it was a Greater Minnesota initiative to kill that particular accountability about 5-6. I can't remember. I'd have to get reading glasses out and go into my computer back at the office and figure it all out. But it was because you're correct.
Right.
There's no reason to train for $9.50 jobs.
Right.
There's no reason to train for jobs that pay $9.50 and don't have benefits. And most of the manufacturing they've done city and urban flight and gone to the farthest piece of asphalt they can find where they can get the lowest job, and there's a hunger for jobs, and people will take whatever they can get.
Right, right.
Mr. Leroy.
Yeah, so, and we're sensitive to the fact that there are substantial wage level differences in urban versus rural Minnesota, and we got very familiar with those differences as we did our first study, because we benchmarked all the deals against local, either county or metropolitan area wage levels. So I understand there's a lot of variation within the state. But I agree with you that, especially from a public policy point of view, there's what we call the hidden taxpayer cost issue. If you allow subsidized employers to pay far below the market in a way that basically ensures people will become more dependent or remain dependent on safety net spending, Medicaid, S-chip, food stamps, earned income tax credit, et cetera. We as taxpayers don't really know the cost of that incentive deal because there are hidden taxpayer costs associated with it. So that's one of the arguments that a lot of public officials embrace when they consider job quality standards. The other program I actually also noticed got a very low score in our report card was the research and development tax credits. In fact, they actually got a slightly lower score than the Job Skills Partnership Program, and they basically only got one score for requiring a level of investment or qualified expenditures, not even job creation requirements, and then they got no points for anything else, nothing for wage requirements or benefits or health care standards or duration or piracy or anything. So a lot of room for improvement there as well. If you had gotten reasonably good scores on those two programs, you would have had a much higher overall ranking. Those are your two outliers.
Please continue.
So as I mentioned, you can't talk about economic development in Minnesota without touching on TIF. The last figure we have, total amount captured, is about $1/3 billion, or 10 times the cost of the Job Z program. And as we documented in our two studies, it's a commonly used incentive when jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, especially suburbs here in the Twin Cities area, pirate jobs from each other. So we did a study called the Thin Cities in December of 2006, where we looked at 86 companies that had received incentives to move around within the same metropolitan area, within your 8-county, now 11-county metropolitan area. Every blue arrow in this map is an outbound move, about 4 out of 5 deals, and every red arrow is either inbound or sideways. 22 of those blue arrows are more than 10 miles long. 3/4 of the deals are TIF deals. And we then analyze them through various metrics, including whether or not you can get to work by transit. So every red arrow in this map, and there are 27 of them, were accessible by public transportation at the beginning of their flight, but ended up in a place that is inaccessible. The orange arrows, of which there are 33, never were accessible at either end of their flights. And at the very bottom, the dark blue arrows, there's only 2 of those, moved basically from inaccessible to accessible. So the net effect is that more than 2/3 of the companies ended up locating in a place where you can't get to work if you don't own a car. And then we analyzed, who doesn't own a car in this market, and it's the same story as other places.
Mr. Leroy?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of created this subset of TIF districts that are moving jobs around on an intrastate basis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a broader explanation of how much of the total TIF spending is the job piracy type incentives that you described?
Well, that's a great question. I don't, and I'm not sure how we could have derived that, because I can give you raw numbers historically on the number of deals which answered yes to question 18 on your disclosure form. Question 18 was added as a result of our testimony in 1999 about our original study, and that's the relocation question. And it was from those yeses to question 18 that we derived the 86 deals here. But we found about 200 deals in that 4-year period that we analyzed statewide that answered yes. And then we didn't map those that were in greater Minnesota. We just focused on the Twin Cities. So it would be whatever the share of 200 out of the total base of deals for those 4 years would be a back of the envelope share. It's not a huge share, but some of these are fairly big deals. And then we looked at various other metrics, including race, poverty, welfare, and so on. And again, the darkest colored in area here is our census tracts with the greatest share of non-white residents. And again, the arrows are the ones, well, all the arrows are the movements. You can see many of them are moving away from people of color, pockets of poverty, pockets of dependence. We analyzed the census tracts from which and into which the deals all moved. The bigger point I want to raise about this study, going back to look at the locations, is a structural flaw in the Weaver Act, right? Since 19...
Roy?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Before you leave that slide
Sure.
on the last one that you were discussing, the percentage of non-white residents, can you just dig into this a little bit more? I mean, the quick headline that looked like you were delivering is that we are using TIF districts to subsidize job movements into areas that are predominantly white. Could you kind of give us a little, and you went through it on the transit, but could you kind of give us a little bit more detail?
Sure. So written in the not the legend box here, but in the narrative of the study, we give you the raw numbers, and I haven't memorized those, but we can look them up quickly on the web, where we give you the average non-white population figures for the census tracts from which the projects moved and into which the projects moved, and compare them. And the net effect is to move jobs from places that are more diverse to places that are less diverse. That's the punchline. So, and you know, it's the variables that we used all kind of overlay and correlate with each other, right? Whether you're talking about poverty, welfare, race, transit dependency, we weren't surprised that they all showed the same rough pattern, but we teased them out.
And I wonder if you have the ability to look at the other aspect of that, which is that a lot of core cities are seeking to gentrify, and as a result, moving a lot of jobs that would be considered to be kind of unattractive from a noise, pollution, or other kind of perspective, and move them out of their core cities so that they can move in other types of development which are considered to be more attractive for a more upscale city resident. I wonder if you can if that's been part of your discussion at all.
It wasn't. We did interview the community development directors of any community that lost or gained 3 or more companies, and that actually gets me to the structural issues I was about to raise with the Weaver Act. And we also read every contemporary press account of every move we could find to get at what was actually said at the time about why the companies were moving. Most of the companies were moving for pretty benign reasons. Some of them didn't own or rented and wanted to own. Some of them wanted to expand and were in a landlocked location and just needed more space and sort of went shopping for the best new place they could find. But some of the suburban jurisdictions were also clearly soliciting and recruiting, especially into industrial parks, mostly tax increment finance industrial parks, where they were trolling for tenants, essentially, in their parks. So it was a mix of push and pull, so to speak. But the structural problem I wanted to raise here, when we interviewed the community development directors who were winning or losing 3 or more companies in these transactions, one of the questions we asked them all was, did you talk to your peer in the other community involved in the transaction? And absolutely everybody said no, and many of them sort of basically said, like, why would we do that? You know, we're competing with them. And to us, this was a striking answer because of the Weaver Act, right? Since 1974, you've had one of the most profound revenue-sharing systems in the country intended to deter this very problem, right? The 8 counties that then comprise the metropolitan area have been sharing 40% of their commercial industrial incremental property tax growth under the Weaver Act since the mid-'70s. What we found is that it matters not. And obviously you've got 3 more counties in the metropolitan area who are absolutely free to get 100% of the increment and don't have to share and we found a number of transactions involving those counties that now are in the bigger metropolitan area that have grown since the act was passed. Our recommendation is to mirror systems that are in place in Dayton, Ohio, and in Denver, requiring people to talk to each other. Basically, in Dayton, for instance, in Montgomery County, Ohio, if a company currently resides in City A and knocks on the door of City B, as a condition of belonging to a regional development effort, Cities A and B are required to talk to each other at the time that transaction happens and to tell the company they're going to talk to each other. Nobody's telling the company where to locate or telling it that it can't move, but they're saying we have a system that favors retention if it's possible, and we communicate with each other. We are true regional partners in economic development, and we share information with each other. It really changes the dynamic between officials at the local level, and it's been a very successful program for Dayton. And Denver has a similar setup under its Code of Ethics for the Economic Development Corporation there. So that's our recommendation if the Weaver Act were to be revisited.
Mr. Leroy, I have another follow-up. If we are creating economic incentives for transit-oriented development and our TIF districts are creating the opposite impact, it sounds to me like we are just kind of at war with our own economic development programs. Would you, generally agree that those two trends are in opposition to each other?
Yeah, that's absolutely the punchline of all of our sprawl studies. We've done them in upstate New York, in Ohio, in Illinois, in Michigan, as well as Minnesota, where you've got one policy silo here called economic development and another policy silo over here called transportation and land use planning, and the right hand is fighting the left. And we think they should be aligned, and the way to align them is to rewrite the eligibility and targeting rules for your incentives in a way that serves goals of better transportation and land use planning. There's a proposal here from a group whose name I'm forgetting right at the moment, called TIF for Todd. And also a bit of advice here is to say, don't create new incentives. You've already got lots of them, just like every other state. Sharpen your toolkit. Hence the title of my presentation today, sharpen the tools you have, including TIF, to better target and get a better bang for the buck, including aligning them with public transportation.
Okay. Please continue.
I just wanted to remind you that two academics have also evaluated the Job Z program, Tanya Hansen and Laura Kalambadakidis, and found no meaningful evidence of job creation impacts from the program, but did find things tied to workforce growth and demographics that did have positive results. This would be consistent with other work that shows that skills-based economic development can be very effective. And obviously from a risk point of view, if you're talking about money to companies that are potentially mobile capital versus investments in things that tend to stay put, like skills and infrastructure, you're reducing your risk and broadening and putting lots of eggs in lots of baskets rather than a few baskets by investing in skills. And we think getting a better bang for the buck. Also want to talk about interstate job piracy briefly, because I know that's been an issue off and on here in the state, and certainly something that prompted Arthur Rolnick to co-author his famous essay 19 years ago here. We updated this issue with a study we published in January called The Job Creation Shell Game, where we called out what we call interstate job fraud. And that's simply saying if you take an existing job and you move it across a state line, often in the same labor market in the same metropolitan area, perversely, states still allow those existing jobs to be called new, or maybe technically new to the state, for purposes of eligibility for incentives. And so we focused on some very extreme examples of this. The most extreme right now is the Kansas City metropolitan area, where numerous companies over the last half a dozen years have jumped the state line back and forth, moving short distances, getting showered with 8-figure subsidy packages under 2 different programs in Missouri and 1 different program in Kansas. There's news on that front. We actually shared the dais at our press conference with an executive from the Hallmark card company in Kansas City when we released this study, because he and 16 other business leaders in the metropolitan area have been publicly yelling at Governors Nixon and Brownback for 2 years to stop the war and stop this craziness. And there's recent news reports we've just blogged about that suggest the governors are close to an agreement to carve out the counties that comprise the Kansas City metropolitan area and make them no longer eligible for the two programs that have been at the heart of the job piracy problem on that state line. When we did not focus on Minnesota in our study, because we tended to focus mostly on multi-state metropolitan areas like Kansas City, like Memphis and Charlotte and New York. But we did pick up, and we do monitor press clips up here. We know that Job Z has been implicated in interstate job movements, at least from Wisconsin, and I think also from Iowa. So our solution, our policy solution, is to simply say, acknowledge the existence of an existing job. If a company wants to move across a state line, that's fine. They're free to do so. And if they want to grow truly new jobs, you could incentivize those in the same way you would incentivize truly new jobs at a company that already resides in your state. But acknowledge the existence of the current jobs as they reside wherever they reside. That's certainly the solution being proposed by the business executives. And we point out that, ironically, I think your state and 39 other states already do this for purposes of intra-state relocation. That is, they say for at least one, or in some cases several, of their major incentive programs, you can't qualify for this program if you're just moving jobs around inside our state line. So it would take, like, literally rewriting 3 or 4 words in the incentive rules of many of the incentive programs to apply interstate, which is what is already true intrastate.
Mr. Leroy, what you're suggesting is that that change is probably best done as a compact between states that would otherwise be competing against each other and trying to have this back and forth. I mean, we would have to be, you can react to this, but if we were going to have that kind of a change, it would work best if there weren't states with signs up that on their borders that said open for business or something like that. That kind of approach would probably not be effective in that environment. But if you could build up a little bit more of a joint agreement that just robbing jobs from each other within the same economic region might not be beneficial, then you could make some progress.
I mean, certainly in a hotspot situation like there is now between Kansas and Missouri, I think there's got to be a negotiated settlement, as there may be any day now there. We made a very strong empirical argument in this study that states should just do it themselves. The history of attempted compacts between governors and states in the Midwest and the Northeast especially, dating back to the early 80s, I mean, I've been watching these things for 30 years, is a failed history. They've never had any binding value. The only time the National Governors Association visited the subject was 20 years ago in 1993. They issued a kind of very waffly statement that had no binding power and expired after 2 years. I'm not holding my breath, frankly. And, you know, the history of interstate compacts is very oddly cobbled together anyway. There's models involving milk and water, but legal scholars I talk to don't think it's a great model to try to apply on economic development incentives. We made the point empirically in our study that if you look at there's a very detailed business census tool called NETS, which enables you to get into very fine-grained analysis about exactly how many jobs are moving into your state, out of your state, how many jobs are created by growth, by shrinkage, by births, by deaths. Every state gains or loses a little bit each year based on cross-border migrations. But even for Texas, where Governor Perry's been the most aggressive in the last year on this front, the net gain for his state is microscopic. I mean, and therefore we think spending much energy chasing jobs from other states is a fool's errand, because the net effect is microscopic. I mean, so he pirates jobs from California recently, Governor Perry does. But what he might not know is that the third largest source of jobs moving into California is Texas. So, who knew, huh? But the data's there if you look for it. So there's my contact information. I look forward to any other questions or follow-up comments you have.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Leroy, and can you provide us a copy of your presentation as well?
Absolutely.
You can distribute that.
Let me
Representative Radinovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I came in a little bit late, and so I don't know if this was addressed, and I don't know if this necessarily is your area of expertise, but you know, there was discussion of building up skills as opposed to chasing capital,
yes,
or capital chasing businesses. I guess, you know, for me, I represent an area in greater Minnesota, and we don't have that concentration of workers in those areas. And I guess the question is, do we then end up competing with states like North and South Dakota, who also are similar for companies, and kind of, I guess, what's your thought on that type of competition? I mean, the discussion earlier, I think you were getting at that open for business, or on the North Dakota border or whatever. And I don't expect that 3M will move to North Dakota. The skills probably aren't there, but we do worry about manufacturers in Greater Minnesota and some of the other places like that, or businesses like that. Could you speak to that at all?
Mr. Leroy.
It's a little bit abstract, unless we talk about specific industries or sectors. But, our general philosophy is that you reduce your risk by investing in things that benefit lots of employers, including locally owned employers and small employers. And at the top of that list will always be skills and infrastructure. They're putting lots of eggs. They're putting your eggs in a lot of baskets. They're not investing in companies that might run away or have a failed business plan. Risk in economic development is an inherent thing you have to control for, and the way you minimize it is by investing in things that benefit the greatest number of companies and making yourself more competitive as a place to relocate or expand based on the skills base that you have. It's a hard thing for some people to get their head around right now, given the elevated rates of unemployment that we're still suffering. But we are, in so many sectors of this country, still very much up against the so-called silver tsunami, the huge number of baby boomers in many occupations that are either out the door already or looking to get ready to walk out the door, and the huge amount of replacement skills needs we have that are not yet planned for. So I would be looking very hard at where your silver tsunami is going to happen.
Representative Kiefer.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine.
Mr. Chair, thank you. We're already having some murmurs about repealing one of the taxes that we just passed a few weeks ago. I'm wondering what your opinion is on how small businesses are going to be hurt by these personal income tax rate hikes. Because a lot of times these small LLCs and S Corp are pass-through income. Do you have an opinion on that?
Mr. Leroy.
Sure. So you have to remember that a lot of companies early in their life, especially if they're structured in ways that the taxes are paid for as a personal income tax, don't have a lot of profits early in their life. And so we make the point that structuring tax credits for small business is often an ineffectual strategy for that very reason. So my guess is that especially for a lot of early life companies with no profits yet, that could be a wash.
Mm-hmm. Representative Mahoney.
Mr. Leroy and Representative Kiefer, your tax credits, if you were going to structure them, and some of the things that I've learned over a number of years, really should be structured to the companies that are employing somewhere between, you can pick the number, somewhere between 75 and 100 and 250, because once companies get to about 50 employees, they either stay there or they literally explode into the 500 employee range, and then they hit another kind of plateau where they stay for a variety of reasons.
They're gazelles or they're not,
Yeah. And so, what's your opinion on, I can guess what your opinion is on just tax credits in general, but geared towards that middle range post, is it pre-gazelle kind of
Sure. Mr. Leroy.
Sure. I think that you're right. Different kinds of assistance help smaller early life companies, again, partly because of the reason they don't have profits to credit against. The other point, though, is that I think strategically, and this really goes to kind of sector targeting, right, sector strategies, cluster strategies. You all have some wonderful clusters here, like your medical instruments cluster, and the question is, what do those industries need, and how do you structure your investments in public goods, your university graduate programs, your infrastructure, your vocational education programs, in ways that make this area stickier and stickier for those companies, where they have more linkages to your public goods and your public institutions and with each other, so that they have fewer and fewer ideas of ever wanting to leave because they're more self-interested in deriving value from your public goods here. That's the bang for the buck. And frankly, again, it's a risk minimization strategy because you're saying, well, maybe this company won't make it, but this is such a hot sector, others will, and dislocated workers who gain great skills will walk across the street and benefit the companies that make it from those that don't.
One more.
Oh, Representative Rajinovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as a follow-up in some ways to Representative Mahoney's question, I get the sense that, a basic economic idea is that some people are good at growing potatoes and some are growing, tomatoes or whatever, and that they trade then based on those strengths. So, I think at the center of the tension for us as legislators, or at least largely for me, is that, are we a state that pursues a higher tax rate and higher services and higher investment in our workforce, or are we a state that, I think opts for, a different policy, perhaps that other states espouse? I mean, do you recommend sort of pursuing one or diversifying, or, what's your theory there?
Mr. Leroy.
Yeah, I think higher rate is not a singular option, right? There's other revenue issues to address adequacy of public services. You can talk about your base. That is, do your tax systems fairly apply across the base of economic activity? Is your tax system modernized to reflect the fact that we've moved from a manufacturing economy to primarily a service sector economy? That's a big modernization issue that a lot of states haven't addressed. And then in your economic development incentive programs, are you really targeting things that aren't happening anyway, so you're not throwing money to cause things to happen that would happen anyway, for instance? Have you closed loopholes regarding passive investment companies and things like that? I think you can do a lot to keep rates down by broadening your base and reducing your loopholes. But the big picture here in many other states is that the amount of revenue attributable to corporate income taxes, especially as a share of your state's general fund, has gone down. And that's true in many states. I devote an entire chapter of my book to that subject. So.
Okay. Mr. Leroy, I have a kind of a follow-up question. I gather that the kind of standard or the mission that you are seeking to evaluate here is that of pure economic growth and job growth. And a lot of the spending that we do in these areas that are labeled as job growth or job creation often are pursuing other ends, or could best be described as pursuing other ends, whether that's a stadium, which does create construction jobs and may help move some development around within an urban area, but is probably more about quality of life and community life than anything else. Another example would be programs, as you talked about, that might direct retail to a food desert. That's more about equity and access, and it's not so much about pure growth. Do you have incentives, or has there been discussion of being more clear about what the actual mission of the programs or the funds might be so that they can be better measured, and not just purely on job growth, but on actually achieving some of the other ends? And it could be any number of things. It could be disparities based on gender and race. It could be disparities based on metro versus greater Minnesota in job availability, income, and so forth. There can be lots of equity-type issues or access issues that you try to address. Are there standards or measures or goals that address some of those things?
I can't point to a model evaluation, like a model umbrella evaluation of a state's incentive menu that's been done that way. Certainly at the heart of our recommendations about sunshine and transparency is creating data that people from any of those perspectives you just ticked off could better understand where the money's going and what taxpayers are getting for their bucks. I think we only have a glimmer of who's using our data on our subsidy tracker, and it's a very broad rainbow of different kinds of people. So I think if you want greater public participation in the debate and a better civic grasp, that is, of what's going on, we think the cornerstone is disclosure. But I can't point to – there's certainly been performance audits and evaluations done of programs here and in other states that get to some of the issues. And to the extent you have programs that do not have required periodic performance evaluations, that would be certainly a thing to fix, right? You want, every 3 to 5 years, you want a performance evaluation. You could have sunsets. You could require reauthorizations after sunsets as a way to really get programs' attention. Those are all good devices.
as I think about the question and your answer, it seems to me that what I'm asking you more about a political question, which is, are we willing to have a discussion about what we're actually trying to achieve with a particular kind of program versus calling it job creation because that's more politically saleable than what we're actually trying to accomplish with that particular program, or perhaps just the local kind of capture of jobs.
No, and I think that's at the heart of a good performance evaluation. I mean, performance audit. If you and that really serves that core debate. That's absolutely where the debate should be, especially at a time now when states are making so many other difficult, painful budget decisions. You know, we don't think that spending for economic development should be subject to any less scrutiny at a time when so many other painful budget decisions are getting made.
Okay. Any last committee questions? Representative Garofalo?
Nothing, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Leroy, for your testimony.
You bet.
And next we have Dane Smith from Growth and Justice.
Okay.
And just for members in the audience, I don't think that Art Rolnick will be joining us based on the fact that he isn't here.
There you go.
Mr. Smith, go ahead with your testimony, please, and identify yourself.
Chairman Winkler, members of the Select Committee, I'm Dane Smith, President of Growth and Justice, and we're a policy research and advocacy organization that seeks a broader prosperity for Minnesota. We have always, at Growth and Justice, been focused on advancing policy that addresses the growing inequality crisis in our state, and there's no better word than crisis to describe it. The Great Recession widened the already unsustainable income and wealth disparities between the top 1%, especially the top 1%, and everyone else. Even as we recover, we see continuing or widening disparities by income and race on everything from unemployment to home ownership to health outcomes to incarceration, all of these closely related, of course. And there is overwhelming evidence, more every day it seems, showing how private sector profits and productivity are not being shared by the vast majority of middle-income workers and households, as wages and benefits for those in the middle and bottom continue to stagnate or decline. We currently are producing research reports and recommendations to reduce race and income gaps in employment. Through our project entitled Workforce Equity for a Competitive Economy, and would recommend to you our Sunday Star Tribune op-ed on this subject, which was published June 16th. And in future hearings of this committee, we hope to present our findings and recommendations as they come. For today, however, we want to talk about this specific subject, this general controversy regarding taxpayer subsidies and incentives for economic development projects, about whether those subsidies are effective in generating significant net gains in living wage jobs and how policy might be improved to seek alternatives to tax breaks and subsidies, or at the very least to impose much tougher requirements in such agreements so that many more living wage jobs are produced. In general, we strongly agree with Mr. Leroy's analysis and recommendation, his presentation, and the work of Good Jobs First, to the effect that tax breaks and special incentives for special projects are really not the best use of taxpayer funds if we are seeking economic growth that benefits the widest number of our people, or unless we get much more aggressive about making those subsidies conditional, absolutely conditional on new living wage jobs or higher wages in existing jobs. In his presentation, we are particularly intrigued by that map showing subsidies moving jobs from more diverse areas in the Twin Cities to less diverse areas in the Twin Cities. That is truly perverse. We're moving jobs with subsidies from places who need them the very most to places that need them the very least. I am a former newspaper journalist, and I think I wrote my first story about the abuse of tax increment financing 25 years ago. And this legislature has been wrestling all that time with how to rein in abusive mechanisms the abusive mechanisms that originally were actually designed to benefit only blighted or high unemployment communities and economically distressed neighborhoods. Since then, we've seen countless examples and horror stories about the use of TIFs for big box retailers in our most affluent suburbs, for golf resorts, and projects that may actually be worsening inequality. So we're all frustrated by the seeming inability of state and local elected officials to resist this demand for tax incentives or other subsidies from developers bearing grandiose project blueprints or only vague promises but no enforceable guarantees of new living wage jobs for folks in our communities who need them the most. And we're as frustrated as everyone else about the inability to react to that.
Mr. Smith, is that I didn't talk to Mr. Leroy. I assume it's okay if we interrupt with member questions along the way?
Sure.
Maybe.
Mr. Chairman, sure.
I think it is. Representative Kiefer.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Smith, you mentioned right off the bat about the disparities and that I agree Minnesota has some problems here compared to other states. I've talked about that in the Jobs Committee. Okay, but a lot of what we're talking about here is our workforce. And we have one of the worst achievement gaps, if not the worst, and I didn't hear you address the education problems.
Right.
And I am just as frustrated because I don't see real reforms in our education system to address this problem. And I'm sorry, when we're blocking things like the LIFO initiatives, teacher tenure, making sure we've got teacher effectiveness, we just lowered the requirements for the basic skills test again this year. These are the things that are going to help the people that we're talking about in the hard inner city areas that we're not doing them any favor by not increasing the standards in education and getting them prepared for the workforce so that they can be in demand for the jobs. I just have to get that out. I'm sorry. I think it's a whole spectrum. And if we're just going to focus on the jobs, well, fine, but let's really look at what's systemically the problem and why this is happening in Minnesota. Thank you.
Mr. Smith, I'll just first address Representative Kiefer. I mean, there is obviously no clear limit on the scope of the issues that we could address in this committee if we're talking about the economy and growth and disparities. And Mr. Smith actually wanted to talk more about training and education, perhaps not in the same direction you're going in, but addressing that general topic. And we asked him to wait for a subsequent hearing, which I think we're going, I don't remember the date, it's not set, but I think we're going to get out of the Capitol and go to one of the job training centers in Minneapolis and talk a lot more about that issue and look at also growing occupations in the future and whether we're doing a good job of linking those training and education programs to the actual jobs that are coming. So we will get to some of that. And if Mr. Smith wants to address your broader point about education reform, of course he can.
Representative Kiefer, Mr. Chairman, I do agree. And our project really does take a holistic view of the education alignment problems and the need to begin investing in early childhood and nudging and moving more of our kids of color, more of our kids who are not doing well, into the skills that they need to take those jobs. That's absolutely right. That's part of it.
Representative Mahoney.
I know I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but there was somebody that was just mentioning the silver tsunami, and I don't think you really have the time to wait to address that particular issue by investing in early childhood education. If that's the plan, it's already failed. I mean, if you want to use that as a plan for the next half of this century, that's a good idea. But there are multiple other options, and I did read your full article in the Sunday paper and wholeheartedly agreed with much of it. Would never want to say agree 100%.
Right.
So anyhow, I'm happy to engage in this particular conversation either in a committee hearing or not a big, I don't like to do a lot of, my goal this summer is to not wear a tie not do too much in terms of legislative priorities this summer. And I'll be kind of talking about this a little bit as we get closer to the session. But my real question is, do you want to define a living wage job? And is it the same in urban Minnesota, suburban Minnesota, greater Minnesota, large, what do they call them out in greater Minnesota, the Wilmer, St. Clouds, the cities of 10 to 15 or 20,000? Could you address that?
Mr. Smith.
Representative Mahoney, Mr. Chairman, no. We have not done a lot of great work defining what we a specific, arbitrary, exact, region-adjusted livable wage versus minimum wage. And I do have a little bit more to say about that later. But
and Mr. Smith, if I could interrupt Representative Mahoney, we actually did have a hearing that delved into that issue quite a bit in this committee, and had the Jobs Now Coalition come in and share their basic family needs calculator adjusted by county or region in the state. And we have a lot more information about that we can make available too.
Good. Thank you.
Mr. Smith, please proceed.
Thank you. Our longstanding economic development principles at Growth and Justice urge giving top priority to broad workforce training, to direct help for workers themselves, broader transportation and public works infrastructure improvement. We know how that drives good job growth, living wage job growth. And most definitely not so-called smokestack chasing. I've heard it also called buffalo hunting, or tax breaks that largely benefit executives and shareholders. Fine people, no doubt, very important folks for Minnesota's continued prosperity, but who already actually have a larger and larger percentage of income and wealth. From our 2009 Statement of Economic Development Policy Priorities, we said this, and I might add that these principles are actually endorsed by economists on the left and the right and in between. One, we really need to avoid or minimize company-specific tax breaks and public subsidies if at all possible. It is better to spend public dollars or cut taxes in ways that benefit broad sections of the economy than to offer narrow tax breaks for specific firms. Two, we say avoid using tax dollars as financial capital for private ventures. Financial resources flow toward investment opportunities through the private sector, not through government. But we know deals are going to happen. I was a political reporter, and I understand that. As they have since the very first constitutional amendment in this state, which was shortly after statehood and provided a rather large bonding subsidy for railroad development. So we know it's happened. We know it's going to happen. So we say secure a strong return on investment from any state economic development initiative, program, or action, setting clear goals and demanding accountability for results. And I'm glad Mr. Leroy spent so much time talking about accountability and reporting. The measurement of impacts, while difficult, is crucially important for accountability. So we urge this committee and the legislature to pursue every reasonable means to reduce state and local government direct subsidies for development and to impose much stronger living wage requirements where possible on all new development agreements, as well as taking a strong look at race equity requirements and hiring goals. Here are a couple just more specific suggestions. State Auditor Rebecca Otto issued an analysis last year of a concept known as pay-as-you-go for TIF districts, in which the developer pays all up front and receives the local government agreed-to incentives only after promises and conditions are met for employment or other pre-agreed public benefit. I am not actually up to speed on exactly how and whether this concept is being implemented, but it certainly makes sense. At any rate, we should strongly consider more ironclad links between any and all subsidies and living wage jobs. Second, we strongly recommend that you take a look at bringing back some variation of the MEAD program, which was a Minnesota innovation in the 1980s and provided temporary wage subsidies targeted to lower-income job seekers. We recommend the work of senior economist Timothy Bartik at the Upjohn Institute in Michigan on this. We recommended this approach when Senator Al Franken proposed it a couple of years ago, actually as something of an alternative to ARRA, and we think it could be a great mechanism for providing thousands of living wage jobs in Minnesota, with the terrific benefit of giving chronically unemployed and underemployed Minnesotans that crucially important on-the-job training and resume experience they desperately need.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
I think you were in the audience when I asked Mr. Leroy about programs whose goal is not pure economic growth or development, but rather programs designed to reduce inequities.
Yes.
As you're describing the Meade proposal, it sounds like that's the goal that you're talking about, not pure growth, but rather targeted incentives to certain populations that may have a harder time finding a high-paying or high-quality job. And I guess I think that your report is based largely on gaps based on race, but I think, and maybe you can expand on this, there are similar concerns that people have about the long-term unemployed or people who are kind of in that, 55 to 65 age range where it's hard to get back into the workforce if you're out of it. Are there other kinds of targeted areas that you would recommend that we focus on in a wage subsidy type program? And maybe Mr. Leroy can discuss this, because I actually thought he might bring up Meade as well.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, nothing leaps to mind, but I'll kick that over to Mr. Leroy, hopefully after I'm almost done here. Let's see, where was I? The point was that, a final point I wanted to make is that Meade subsidies would be a whole lot less costly overall than tax breaks and incentives, and much more cost-effective in getting living wages into the hands of families and children who need and deserve a larger share of our economic growth. Very last point, perhaps most obviously, elephant in the room, we do think we need a minimum wage adjustment in Minnesota, as close to a reasonable living wage, however that's determined, as possible. People who are working all day should not live in official poverty. That seems somehow un-American, and that's where we are with the minimum wage now. I wanted to draw your attention to a news report in the Capitol Report today. I think most of you get that newspaper in your offices. That shows it's by a fellow named Hanauer, called "A Capitalist Case for a Minimum Wage of $15 an Hour." We are not endorsing an explicit amount at this time, but it's an intriguing piece, and he talks about how increasing wages and income for people who buy the stuff that business sells is a tremendous economic inducement. It makes common sense. And this idea of separating pure growth from equity just doesn't make sense. We know that pure growth is actually encouraged, and that it happens as a result of equity, a greater equity in an economy.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions for Mr. Smith. First of all, good to see you, Mr. Smith. I hope you're having a nice summer. My first question is, previously the governor and the chairman mentioned this, the idea of providing an incentive for businesses to supplement the costs of wages is something that's been proposed and something that your organization has supported. The idea that by making it, at least on a temporary basis, more affordable to hire more employees would in fact create more jobs and provide more opportunities to those who are looking for employment. Yet at the same time, you've come out in favor here of something that would do the exact opposite. The minimum wage would increase the cost of businesses, and I'm just wondering if you could lay out for me why in one instance you're advocating for a policy that seems to acknowledge the cost of employees and making it more affordable for them to create more opportunities, but then on the other hand, you're advocating a policy that makes things more expensive. Can you just explain that argument to me?
Mr. Smith.
You can move the chair so I can see you, because I just see the top half of your face. It's like you're behind a TV monitor, and I just see.
Members of the committee, Representative Garofalo, you always ask just the best questions, and I really appreciate that. Actually, I don't think that there needs to be some sort of Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind.
Are you saying I have a small mind?
Lord,
maybe your consistency isn't foolish.
Right? And I'm not saying that that's there is some tension between those two propositions. However, I really do believe that if we had the two together, a wage subsidy that encouraged employers to hire more people, it might offset the cost of the minimum wage. And of course, we know that many of the living wage jobs that already exist are at that level or above, and so we think that the larger purpose of more large living wage jobs is still served.
And Mr. Chairman, and just two comments just for the committee. Number one is I would encourage Mr. Smith and the chairman to support an expansion of the Minnesota Working Family Credit. I mean, this is an idea that has long bipartisan support. If the goal truly is to get more money into the pockets of those who are working to encourage work, it has a very low administration cost. We don't have to build a new agency. We don't have to have blue ribbon commissions or grow the workforce of the state of the government of the state of Minnesota to accomplish this. It's got long bipartisan support and it's efficient and it's targeted.
Yes.
So you don't have the collateral damage of mandating wage increases for my high school son versus differentiating the wage costs of someone who's a single parent or someone who's in a low wage or low skill job. Second of all, I want to compliment the chairman for having this hearing and for pointing this out. There's a little bit of Madison Avenue that goes on here at the Capitol where people will come in and it doesn't matter what the idea is, they'll say it's about jobs because they know that that's something that matters to all of us. So they'll come in with an idea and I don't care what the idea is. It can be a bad idea. It can be a good idea. And they can say it's really about jobs. And there's a consistency on both sides of the aisle, and from the business community and from the unionists to it's all about jobs. And in reality, I'm not really. They might be trying to sell us something there on occasion. So I want to thank the chairman for having the hearing on this. That a lot of times when we're talking about tax preferences, when we're talking about tax credits, I wouldn't categorize it as spending, but it can be categorized as a subsidy. And we need to have more analysis of this stuff on both sides. We've seen historically that. Contrary to public opinion, big business loves big government because I'm sorry too. Yeah, and so the reason for that is that big business has the ability to come up here to lobby and to get preferences in the tax code that small businesses or independent businesses just don't have that opportunity. And so the more scrutiny, the more analysis we can do on these issues. I want to compliment you on that, and I hope it's something that we continue to work on in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Representative Garofalo, it's unfortunate that you missed Mr. Leroy's testimony because he gave us a barrel full of things that we could do differently in Minnesota to make the programs that we have more transparent and more accountable and deliver more of the things that we want them to accomplish. And so there's a great deal of work that can be done, and I think our committee consultant is capturing a lot of that, and we will have I think, a set of recommendations that the legislature can take up next session that might start to make some of those reforms and changes. And I hope that's bipartisan. And frankly, I agree with you. The working family credit is a good idea. And as we heard earlier this session, it's a good idea to do it in conjunction with the minimum wage.
That's an opinion, not a fact, Mr. Chairman. But
Mr. Smith.
Representative Garofalo, members of committee, chairman, we do support that working family credit in some combination with these other proposals. And I agree with all of your points. Everything is about jobs, as it should be, and a lot of times it really isn't.
And Mr. Smith, I don't know if you're going to continue with testimony, but I understand that in your report you have something like a community compact or something like
community benefits agreement. Yeah. Yes, again, this report is focused in a little bit more on some what we need to close the race gaps, the unemployment race gaps. But we say to tie support for economic development projects to community benefit agreements, so-called CBA. A community benefit agreement is a legally enforceable contract signed by community groups and a developer that set forth the dividends that should be provided to local communities as part of a development project. Typically, a CBA arises out of direct negotiations between a developer and organized representatives of affected communities, often with the support of local public officials. CBAs may include living wage requirements, minority contracting, first source hiring preferences, job training programs, affordable housing set-asides, transit integration, and other provisions. So that's a good, strong concept to pursue. An example of this was an incredibly successful project that converted the Lake Street Sears store into, I believe it was a Lina, turned it into a headquarters. They discovered that many people in the neighborhood didn't have jobs, were unemployed, and they created a community benefit agreement with Alina, workforce developers, some excellent nonprofits who are moving people into workforce readiness, and they had a remarkable turnaround in that neighborhood. So these are classic examples of how CBAs can work.
Mr. Smith, just to be clear, we had a discussion this last session related to the Rochester Destination Medical Center subsidy related to labor peace agreements, which I gather is not the kind of thing that you're suggesting for your community benefit agreement. This is something that it sounds like what you're suggesting is more geographic and locally based rather than a kind of a labor versus management or labor versus developer kind of issue. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, yes, that's correct. And that completes my testimony.
Okay. Mr. Leroy?
Sure. It's great to hear people talk about community benefits agreements. We published the first manual on them 11 years ago and co-sponsored 2 conferences with the Partnership for Working Families, whose members really pioneered this method, especially in Los Angeles. And they are terrific, project-specific. They're not policies per se, although you can borrow from them in thinking about policies, but they are project-specific ways to ensure that people who hung in there during the tough years in urban areas benefit from redevelopment.
And Mr. Leroy, are you aware of states that have sought to use community benefit agreements as a policy tool, creating whether it's an incentive preference or some other mandate, I suppose, to encourage more projects to include CBAs, or if we went down that path, would we be among the first or the first?
I'm not aware of a state that's attempted to do that. A few cities have debated them as policies and either de facto adopted them as practice through their redevelopment agencies or through broader applications of their living wage laws borrowed partially from them. I think it's difficult, and I would point to New York City as a Exhibit A of the difficulties, because one person's ceiling becomes another person's floor, and there's been some very aggressive sort of appropriation of the concept by developers, frankly, in ways that kind of undoes some of the original intent. To put it politely.
Mr. Leroy, could you be a little bit more forthcoming in how it's worked the other way?
Sure. I mean, so the New York Yankees new stadium project in the South Bronx had a community benefits agreement, which consisted of a slush fund, for lack of a better term, for some of the local elected officials and T-shirts and free tickets for some kids in the neighborhood. I mean, it was nothing like what Mr. Smith just described. It wasn't about first source hiring for the construction jobs or pre-apprenticeship programs or anything that I would think of as a real community benefit agreement. So it's the term has been grabbed upon shrewdly by some people as a public relations hook.
And Mr. Leroy, I presume that if we had standards and criteria in law that might, and some accountability and reporting for that, it may help somewhat.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first source hiring is a good example where if you have the workforce development infrastructure in place to help create qualified pre-apprentices for construction work or entry-level workers for permanent job creation, giving those graduates from those programs the first 2 weeks or whatever to to compete, to qualify for those jobs is a great thing. It addresses the broader issue I think we're both saying here, which is you want public money spent in ways that meets the definition of the word incentive, that's addressing a market imperfection, that's causing something to happen that isn't happening but should happen.
Representative Mahoney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Leroy and Mr. Smith. You both keep talking about job training. I have spent a lot of time talking to HR departments and chief executive officers and actual people, department managers, and I have yet to hear when you have the same kind of business, the same kind of job, any one of those dozens that I've talked to come up with the same definition of this is what I need from a new hire. I believe there's one that a couple of trying to think of, Minsky put one together for machinists 2 semesters. Actually, not only did I just read about it, but I'd heard about it before. We're policymakers. I think there's a data center person, there's a lawyer, there's a labor guy, there's another lawyer, there's a retired guy around here. We try to come up with these parameters. And our policy says train for this. And we've made one industry happy or one segment of that industry happy, but we've made the other 6 or 10 or 12 in the cluster like, oh, you didn't take our thing into consideration. So how do you suggest that we get these job training programs? How do you suggest that you get these people to maybe talk to each other? That would be an interesting concept. I mean, I'm not at a loss. I'm just very frustrated. I have multiple ideas on how to move forward on this, but I get tired of having those fights with people who have a whole lot more lobbyists than I have time.
Sure.
And Representative Mahoney, we are going to devote a whole hearing to this topic as well, but I think it is that when we have Mr. Leroy here, it would be very helpful to get his reaction to that.
It's a little bit hard to answer in the abstract. I mean, regarding a specific community benefit agreement, pre-apprenticeship or for construction jobs or permanent job trajectory, obviously involving the specific employers up front who either expect to build the project or to be tenants of the project with the permanent jobs would be critical, right, to find out what it is they're not getting that they need. I assume that, like most markets, you've got a labor management construction apprenticeship program that would be the suitable residents for pre-apprenticeship programs. Nationally, they certainly have the best track record on diversity, if increased diversity in the building trades is an objective, and long-term placement and retention and credentialization of graduates. On the permanent job side, it would really depend, again, on who the tenants are going to be and what their training needs are, and that's going to vary a lot, obviously, depending on what kind of, is it an office park versus a mixed-use retail, or those would be very different kettles of fish.
Representative Mahoney.
Well, and therein lies the problem, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry. And therein lies the problem. Business comes to government, says train our workers, and by the way, we want to specifically train for this type of job.
Right.
Government goes and collaborates with a nonprofit and a business. They train 50 employees, and the program, they've trained their 50. That's what their goal was.
Right.
They put that on the shelf because, oh, we're done training our 50.
Right.
And you never see that program again. So then the next business comes along and says, please train our people for this particular job. It's 75% of the same last job that they trained, but you can't pull that old one off the shelf because the business says, well, that doesn't meet our needs. So tell me, because frankly, I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green, or whatever.
Right.
None of us like to spend more taxpayer dollars than we have to.
Whoa, hey, hold on.
You know,
You're from St. Paul, don't
I was.
do that.
There's a lot of people in this legislature that were a little worried about that tax bracket. So that's my frustration, and you know, I chair the Jobs Committee, and I have to figure out ways to spend that workforce dollar, and I look at it and I go, boy, didn't we just do this 2 years ago or 4 years ago?
Right. I mean, I would certainly defer to people who specialize carefully in this. My equivalent person in this space at the national level is called the National Skills Coalition. The executive director's name is Andy Van Clunen, and I'll be glad to link him to you right away for their best practices. It's a very sophisticated practitioners network on workforce development that might be able to even provide model remedies for you.
That'd be great.
Sure.
Representative Mahoney and members of the committee, I know what you're talking about. I can see it. In my neighborhood, they're tearing down a Minskew facility that was built to train workers at the Ford plant, and I think they put that up just 10 years ago or so. Might have been a little longer. But in an increasingly dynamic economy, too, training people for specific jobs is perilous because the jobs are changing so fast, so rapidly, all the time. And one of the things that we're recommending in our workforce development work is more emphasis on getting apprenticeships and on-the-job training, getting people in the place and learning the job there sooner rather than later. I think that's an important dimension to it. And we know that the Commissioner Rosenstone with Minskew is by all accounts, having some success refining this training to work situation. He's listening to employers and trying to accommodate their concerns. But there again, there might be some concern again with training too specifically for jobs.
Mr. Chair, one last comment, and then I'll be done. Yeah, I did one of those political junkets that I had to pay for out of my own pocket, which I love to do.
It's not a junket, Tim.
Oh, it's not a junket then? And I spent a week in Germany. I spent a week in Germany, and what shocked me, I'm flat out, almost you could have knocked me over with a feather. They have 350 job classifications that they train for. And each one of those job classifications has a 1 or 2 page outline of the things you're supposed to know when you're done, before you are considered a skilled employee. And then it's left up to the teacher. So it's not a syllabus, or maybe it is, but it's not a copyright thing. And you train to that. And business sits down with I don't know who comes from the training facility, but business and labor sit down and say, yeah, you know, you're going to be a plumbing and heating specialist. To their chagrin, they don't have pipe fitters. I'm sorry for that. But they have 2 pages of you need to know this principle and that principle and that principle, and you need to know this about computers. And, you know, otherwise you don't get your certificate at the end. But business, you know, the 500 contractors and the 2 or 3 labor unions that cover those people sit down and say, yeah, that's what, and then every business takes it from there, which drives, you know, if you're going to pay for it, you may as well, it's a simpler way at the end of the day. And all these job-specific training programs that we do are, I don't want to say they're a waste, but they're very frustrating when you see that money go out the door and you know you're only going to train 200 people.
Mm-hmm. Representative Mahoney, I'd have one follow-up comment. I mean, the kind of classification and negotiation approach could be one thing. As Mr. Smith was talking about Meade, another thought that has occurred to me is that we could also just subsidize the wages of employees who are being trained by employers, and the employees themselves could decide how to train them and what they need. And the state's role is to help get people into the job. And as Mr. Smith said, let the employer and the employee figure it out from there. And I'm not sure if we could get to that level of negotiation and organization in our economy, in our state, as they have it in Germany, with, you know, a slightly different mentality and history about these things. So But another option could be just a simple wage subsidy for training. Something I've thought about anyway. Representative Ward, you have a question.
Thank you. Something of perhaps a question in here, but more of a comment in trying to tie some of these things together. One of the issues in early childhood education and the need for it is that children are not experiencing the rich environment at home. Part of that is because if families are working on survival mode, they don't have the time and the energy and the resources to create a rich environment for young children to be ready to go to school and ready to learn. I attribute part of that to the lack and I would say defeat of vocational education starting about 40 years ago. That we have lost those very basic programs in schools that help develop job skills in terms of thinking. One of the problems and challenges of education is not just to train for a particular job or specialty, whether it's in high school, junior high, starting back whenever, or in college or post-secondary, or a training program in the workplace, is to train people to think and to learn. And I think we've lost a lot of that, and then with that, some work ethic. I've attended some conferences with the Chamber as well as the High Tech Association, and they say, give us workers who are willing to learn and who can think, who know how to show up for a job, how to be disciplined, self-disciplined. So, I think we can provide all sorts of programs, but if we are missing some of these very basic things, we're not going to get the full benefit of our investments. So I agree with you in terms of, I don't feel like it's not overwhelmingly difficult, it's frustrating, because we need to pull a lot of these pieces together. So the education, preschool, we need to supplement income so that families have the resources they need to have a decent living and provide for their children. We need to provide the education all the way through. And I'm just wondering if either of you have tried to pull some of those pieces together, and I'm thinking particularly of vocational education, if that's helpful.
Mr. Leroy, any final comments?
No, that's not a specialty of ours. I would also refer you to the National Skills Coalition on that, and be glad to have staff get contact information for Andy Van Clunen.
Representative Ward, members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, we actually have done a lot of advocacy, and we're doing a lot of ongoing learning around early childhood and how emphasis needs to be not just on content and learning a certain body of knowledge, but something intriguing is emerging in that area you're talking about, called executive function, and it's the part of the brain where early on children who are raised in that rich environment are learning to problem solve. They can see their pathway to agency, to their own effectiveness. And it's really interesting and kind of emerging, intriguing stuff. There's actually a luncheon group meeting on this at the Hope Lutheran Church in Dinkytown in about 20 minutes. So if you hustle over there, pretty interesting stuff.
On that note, members, I think we are close to our allotted time, and so Representative Keeper.
Thanks. Just a confirmation that we'll get Mr. Leroy's presentation for all the members. Thank you.
It's already on your laptop.
All right. Thank you, members. We are adjourned.
Brian.